Story: a homeless man repaired a cabin, unaware the woman who hired him was a secret billionaire. The city awoke to a symphony of noise, the rumble of the first subway train, the groan of garbage trucks, the distant wail of a siren. But for Arthur, the day began with a different sound, the sharp, rhythmic hiss of the park sprinklers. It was his alarm clock, a 10-minute warning before the manicured lawns of St. James Park became a minefield of cold, spraying water. He swung his legs off the hard, unforgiving slats of the bench that had served as his bed, his joints protesting with a chorus of aches. The damp chill of the pre-dawn air clung to his thin jacket, a constant companion for the better part of 3 years. He was a ghost in the city's machine, a man whose edges had been blurred by indifference. The river of humanity would soon flow around him, men in crisp suits clutching briefcases, women in running shoes with earbuds blocking out the world, students laughing as they hurried to class. They saw him, but they didn't see him. They saw a worn-out coat, a weathered face, and graying, untrimmed beard. They saw a stereotype, a problem to be ignored. They did not see the master carpenter. His first task of the day was the scavenger's hunt. With a well-used plastic bag in hand, he navigated the familiar alleys and overflowing bins, his eyes expertly scanning for the glint of aluminum. It was a demeaning, yet necessary ritual. 30 cans for a hot coffee, 50 for a day-old pastry to go with it. It was a currency of survival, and Arthur was a reluctant expert. After securing his modest breakfast, he returned to his bench, the day's most important ritual about to begin. From beneath a loose flap of lining in his coat, he carefully extracted a long, narrow bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Unrolling it revealed its precious contents, a small, curated set of carpentry tools. They were not just objects. They were relics of a forgotten life, the last tangible connection to the man he used to be. There was a Stanley handplane, its rosewood handle worn smooth and dark from decades of his grip. A set of 4 Marples chisels with blue plastic handles, their steel edges honed to a razor's sharpness. A small, perfectly balanced hammer and a folding wooden rule. They were old, but they were immaculate. With the tenderness of a priest tending to sacred artifacts, Arthur began his work. He took out a small, soft rag and a tin of oil. He wiped down each handle, his calloused thumb tracing the familiar grain of the wood. He checked the edge of each chisel, holding it up to the weak morning light, his breath fogging the polished steel. He wasn't just cleaning them, he was communing with them. These tools had built magnificent things, custom-made staircases that flowed like waterfalls, bookshelves that held a family's history, cradles that rocked new life. In his hands, wood did not just become furniture, it became a story. Now, they lay dormant, their potential sleeping alongside his own. A burst of laughter from across the lawn broke his concentration. A young father was teaching his small son, no older than 5, how to throw a baseball. The boy's throw was clumsy, the ball bouncing harmlessly on the grass, but the father's praise was loud and genuine. For Arthur, the scene was a punch to the gut. The world went hazy, the sounds of the park fading into a dull roar, replaced by an echo from the past. The scent of cedar and sawdust filled his nostrils. He was in his workshop, a place of light and creation. A much smaller hand, soft and trusting, was nestled in his own. "Like this, Dad?" a high-pitched voice asked. Arthur looked down at his own son Daniel, who was carefully trying to sand a small block of pine. "Just like that, son," Arthur had said, his voice thick with pride. "Let the wood tell you when it's ready. You just have to listen." The memory was so vivid it made his chest ache with a hollow physical pain. He could almost feel the phantom weight of his son's hand in his. That workshop, his business, his home, his family, all gone. Wiped out by a cascade of betrayal and tragedy that had eroded his life like a relentless tide, leaving him stranded on this lonely island of a park bench. He squeezed his eyes shut, pushing the memory back down into the vault where he kept all the things that hurt too much. He focused on the cold, hard reality of the chisel in his hand. The steel was real. The past was a ghost. Across the city, in a place Arthur couldn't possibly imagine, another kind of ghost was being confronted. The boardroom on the 80th floor of the Vance Holdings Tower was a tomb of glass and steel. From this height, the bustling city was reduced to a silent, sprawling model. The people were ants, their struggles and joys insignificant. Inside, the only sound was the calm, measured voice of its CEO, Evelyn Vance. The numbers in the quarterly report for the Phoenix Project are creative mark. Evelyn, at 52, possessed a stillness that many mistook for coldness. She was dressed in a simple but exquisitely tailored gray suit, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, missed nothing. Markham, the executive vice president, sweating in his $1,000 suit, forced a laugh. Creative? Evelyn, I think you mean optimistic. We're projecting strong future growth based on... I don't care about projections, Evelyn cut in, her voice never rising but somehow slicing through his bluster. I care about facts. And the fact is, the invoices from Apex Steel suppliers don't match the shipping manifests. Another fact is that Apex Steel Suppliers is a shell corporation registered to an address in the Cayman Islands. An address that, with a little digging, my investigators found is linked to your brother-in-law. The blood drained from Markham's face. He had worked for her for 15 years. He had been to her grandfather's cabin for company retreats. He had been, she thought, a friend. Evelyn, there's a misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, was my belief that you possessed a shred of integrity. You are fired. Security will escort you out. I expect the embezzled funds to be returned within 48 hours, or this conversation will continue with the district attorney. She watched, her face an unreadable mask, as two security guards entered and quietly led the crumbling executive from the room. When the door closed, Evelyn let out a long, slow breath. It wasn't anger she felt, not anymore. It was a profound and soul-crushing weariness. She was surrounded by sharks, sycophants, and liars, all drawn to the scent of her family's fortune. She had built an empire on a foundation of her father's shrewdness, but she felt as though she had lost her soul in the process. Later that evening, she stood in her penthouse apartment. It was a masterpiece of minimalist design, with marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking panorama of the city lights. But to Evelyn, it felt like a beautiful, sterile prison. The art on the walls was worth millions, but it offered no comfort. The silence was absolute and deafening. Her gaze fell on a single, old photograph on her otherwise empty desk. It was a faded, sepia-toned image of a young girl with a scraped knee and a gap-toothed smile, standing next to a man with kind eyes and a rugged, weathered face. His hands, resting on her shoulders, were large and calloused, but gentle. It was her, at age 7, with her grandfather, Robert. The photo was taken in front of his cabin in the mountains. He had built it himself, log by log. He was a carpenter. He wasn't rich or famous, but he was the wisest, most honorable man she had ever known. He had taught her how to tell an oak from a maple, how to drive a nail straight and true, and how to live a life of purpose. Character is like a good piece of wood, Evie, he used to say, his voice rumbling like distant thunder. It can be bent and tested, but a good, honest grain will never break. It can't be faked. She ran a finger over the image of his smiling face. He built things that lasted. He built people up too. And in this cold glass tower, surrounded by people who would sell their own mothers for a stock option, she missed him with an intensity that stole her breath. An idea began to form in her mind, a quiet rebellion against her own life. The cabin. It was still there, she knew, left to her in his will. She hadn't been back in 20 years. It was probably falling apart, succumbing to the slow, patient power of the forest. She had to fix it. She had to restore it. But she couldn't call a contractor from her own firm. They would see it as a project, a line item on a budget. They would gut it, sanitize it, and strip it of its soul. This cabin didn't need a contractor. It needed a craftsman, someone who understood wood, who understood that a home was more than just walls and a roof. Someone who, like her grandfather, knew that character was something you built, not something you bought. Her gaze drifted down to the city lights, to the thousands of tiny, anonymous lives flickering below. Somewhere down there, among the ghosts and the dreamers, was the person she was looking for. She didn't know his name or his face, but she knew what she was looking for. She was looking for a man with an honest grain. And Evelyn Vance, for the first time in a very long time, felt a flicker of hope. Her plan was audacious, unconventional, and perhaps even a little crazy. But it was hers. The search would begin tomorrow. The next morning, the pinstripe suit and silk blouse were gone, replaced by worn jeans, a faded flannel shirt she'd found in the back of her closet, and sturdy hiking boots. Evelyn Vance, the titan of industry, had vanished. In her place was just Evelyn, a woman with a mission, her silver-streaked hair tucked under a simple baseball cap. She left her luxury sedan in the garage and took the subway downtown, the anonymity of the crowded car, a welcome cloak. Her destination was St. James Park. Her plan was simple, yet required a commodity she rarely used: patience. She wasn't just looking for a worker, she was conducting the most unorthodox character interview of her life. She found a bench with a clear view of the one Arthur occupied and settled in with a worn paperback, a prop she didn't intend to read. For 2 days she watched. Her observation was clinical, methodical. She noted his routine: the morning scavenge, the meticulous care for his tools, the long hours he spent simply sitting, lost in a world of his own. But it was the small, unscripted moments that she cataloged most carefully. On the first afternoon, a young mother struggling with a stroller and 2 wailing toddlers dropped her grocery bag, sending apples rolling across the pavement. People hurried past, averting their eyes. Arthur, without a moment's hesitation, rose from his bench. He didn't speak, just moved with a quiet efficiency, gathering the escaped fruit and placing it gently back into the woman's bag. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod and returned to his bench before the flustered mother could even properly thank him. It was a gesture of pure, unrewarded decency. Evelyn made a mental note. The next day, she saw him approached by a tourist couple, maps unfolded, looking utterly lost. He gave them clear, simple directions. The man, grateful, tried to press a $10 bill into his hand. Evelyn leaned forward slightly, watching intently. Arthur held up a hand, shaking his head. "No, thank you," she heard him say, his voice raspy but firm. "Just helping." The couple, confused but impressed, moved on. Arthur's pride, she realized, was a fortress, battered but unbreached. The final piece of evidence came in the form of a small, scruffy terrier, shivering in the afternoon chill. It approached Arthur's bench hesitantly. He had just finished his meager lunch, half a sandwich he'd bought with the morning's can money. He looked at the dog, then at the remaining half of his sandwich. With a sigh, he broke it in 2 and tossed a piece to the ground. The dog snatched it up gratefully. He had so little, yet he shared it. Evelyn closed her book. She had seen enough. The data was collected, the conclusion clear. This was her man. She stood and walked towards him, her steps measured. As she approached, he looked up, his eyes instantly wary. It was the look of a man who had learned that unexpected attention usually meant trouble. "Excuse me," Evelyn began, her voice calm and respectful. She deliberately kept a polite distance, not wanting to crowd him. Arthur's gaze flickered from her face to her worn boots and back again. She didn't look like a cop, a social worker, or someone about to offer him a lecture on redemption. He remained silent, waiting. "I saw you with those tools," she said, nodding toward the oilcloth bundle resting beside him. "And I saw you helping that family yesterday. You have good hands." It was an unusual compliment, and it seemed to disarm him slightly. "They've seen better days," he mumbled, his eyes dropping to his own calloused, grime-caked hands. "I have an old cabin," Evelyn continued, getting straight to the point. "Up in the mountains, it belonged to my grandfather. It's fallen into disrepair. It needs more than just a handyman. It needs a gentle hand, someone who understands wood, not just nails and glue." Arthur's head came up at that. The phrase "understands wood" was a key, turning a lock deep inside him. It was the language of his craft, a language he hadn't heard spoken with any real meaning in years. Still, suspicion was a hard habit to break. "Why me?" he asked, his voice a low gravel. "There are 100 carpenters in the phone book. Insured. Licensed. And I'm not looking for a licensed contractor," Evelyn said, her gaze steady and honest. "I've dealt with them. They see a job, a budget, a timeline. I need someone who will see the heart of the place. I saw the way you care for your tools. A man who respects his tools respects his work." He was silent for a long moment, studying her face, searching for the catch. Everyone wanted something. "What's the pay?" he finally asked, the question tasting like ash in his mouth. He hated that his life had been reduced to this. "I can't pay a full contractor's rate," she said truthfully, "but it's a fair wage. I'll provide a clean, warm place for you to stay while you work a small guest cottage on the property. I'll give you an advance for supplies. And the rest when the job is done to your satisfaction." She added the last three words deliberately. "To your satisfaction." Lon. It was a masterstroke, appealing not to his need, but to his dormant pride as a craftsman. Arthur looked from her earnest face to his precious tools, then back again. The proposition was absurd. A strange woman in a park offering him a job in the mountains. It had all the hallmarks of a scam or something worse. Every instinct screamed at him to say no, to retreat into the miserable safety of his routine. But then he thought of another night on the cold bench, another morning hunting for cans, another day of being invisible. And he thought of the smell of fresh-cut pine, the heft of a hammer in his hand, the deep satisfaction of a perfectly set joint. It was a chance, however slim, to be the man he used to be, if only for a few weeks. The craftsman in him was starving, and Evelyn was offering a feast. "The cabin," he said slowly, testing the word. "What kind of shape is it in?" "It needs a lot of work," Evelyn admitted. "The porch is rotting, the roof leaks, some of the windows are broken. It needs someone who can bring it back from the brink." A flicker of something, a professional curiosity, a challenge ignited in Arthur's eyes. Bringing things back from the brink was a specialty of his. Or it used to be. He took a deep breath, the city air feeling thin and stale. "All right," he said, the word coming out with more force than he expected. "I'll take the job." A wave of relief washed over Evelyn, so profound she had to stop herself from smiling too broadly. "Good," she said, keeping her tone even. "My name is Evelyn. Can you be ready to leave tomorrow morning?" "I'm ready now," Arthur said, gesturing to the small bundle of tools and a threadbare knapsack that contained all his worldly possessions. Evelyn nodded, a new respect dawning in her. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, sealed envelope. "Here's $200, she said, placing it on the bench between them. "For any personal things you might need, and for the first round of supplies. We'll stop at a hardware store on the way out of town. I'll pick you up here, 8 a.m. sharp." Arthur looked at the envelope, then at her. He didn't reach for it immediately. "How do I know you'll show up?" It was a fair question. Evelyn met his gaze without flinching. "You don't," she said simply. "But I will. And how do I know you won't just take the money and disappear?" A wry, tired smile touched Arthur's lips for the first time. "You don't," he echoed, "but I'll be here." It was an agreement built on a fragile, unspoken trust between two complete strangers, an act of faith on both sides. Evelyn gave a single, decisive nod. 8 a.m. then, Arthur." She turned and walked away, melting back into the flow of the city. Arthur sat for a long moment, staring at the white envelope on the bench. It felt heavier than a stack of cash. It felt like a down payment on a life he thought was gone forever. He picked it up, the crisp paper foreign in his rough hands. He didn't open it. Instead, he carefully tucked it into the same inner pocket where he kept his tools, right next to the heart of the man he once was, and the man he was terrified and thrilled he might just get to be again. The echo of a hammer was calling to him from a distant mountain, and for the first time in 3 years, he was ready to answer. The next morning, at precisely 7:58 a.m., an old, dust-colored Ford Ranger pickup truck pulled up to the curb beside St. James Park. It was a humble, hard-working vehicle, its fenders speckled with rust and its bed scratched from years of hauling. It was so utterly unassuming that it was the perfect camouflage for a billionaire. Arthur, who had been waiting since sunrise, felt a knot of tension in his stomach loosen. She had come. He picked up his knapsack and his oilcloth-wrapped tools and walked to the passenger door. Evelyn leaned across the seat to push it open for him. "Morning, Arthur. Right on time." "A carpenter who can't keep time isn't much of a carpenter," he replied, settling into the worn seat. The cab smelled faintly of oil and earth, a scent far more comforting to him than the city's perfume of exhaust fumes and hot pavement. As they pulled away from the curb, leaving the park bench shrinking in the rearview mirror, Arthur felt a strange sense of dislocation. He was leaving the only home he'd known for 3 years, a place of misery, yes, but a familiar one. Now he was heading into the unknown, a passenger in a stranger's truck, driven by a flicker of hope that felt dangerously fragile. The city fought to hold on to them, ensnaring them in a web of traffic and noise. Horns blared, sirens wailed, and the gray canyons of concrete and glass seemed to press in on all sides. Evelyn navigated the chaos with a calm, focused competence, her hands steady on the wheel. They didn't speak much. The roar of the city filled the silence. But as they finally broke free onto the open highway, the landscape began to change, and so did the atmosphere inside the truck. The monotonous gray of the urban sprawl gave way to rolling green hills. The sky widened, a brilliant, clean blue. The air that drifted through the open windows was fresh, carrying the scent of damp earth and growing things. It was like exhaling after holding your breath for a very long time. They passed a sprawling new suburban development, a massive construction site where dozens of identical houses were being thrown up in neat, sterile rows. The houses were all beige siding and two-car garages, framed with cheap lumber and slapped together with nail guns, designed for speed and profit, not longevity. Arthur stared at the scene, a bitter taste rising in his throat. The sight triggered a memory, sharp and unwelcome. He was standing on a similar site, but the house was unique, designed by him and his partner, David. It was a custom build, full of complex angles and beautiful Douglas fir beams that he had hand-selected. The scent of sawdust was his perfume. He remembered the pride swelling in his chest as he handed the keys to a young family, their faces alight with a joy so pure it was dazzling. Miller and Sons Carpentry, their sign had read. Daniel, his own son, had worked with them during the summers, a lanky teenager learning the trade. They weren't just building houses, they were building dreams. Then came the second memory, a darker one that always followed. The stark, white-walled office of an accountant. The word insolvent, the revelation of David's secret life, a gambling addiction that had siphoned every penny from their business accounts, leaving a mountain of debt and a string of broken contracts. David, his friend since childhood, had vanished, leaving Arthur to face the wreckage. The lawsuits, the bankruptcy, the shame. The dream had become a nightmare. He turned his head away from the window, his jaw tight. He could feel the phantom weight of that failure settle on his shoulders again. As if sensing his shift in mood, Evelyn spoke, her voice pulling him back to the present. "A penny for your thoughts?" Arthur just shook his head. "They're not worth that much." Evelyn didn't press. She understood the shadows of the past and the privacy they required. A few miles later, the scent of pine became stronger as they began their ascent into the foothills of the mountains. For Evelyn, this smell was a key to a different kind of memory, a brighter one. She was 8 years old, her legs too short to keep up with her grandfather's long strides as they walked through this very forest. He stopped and pointed to a towering pine. "See that bark, Evie? Rough and furrowed, like an old man's face. That's a ponderosa pine. And that one," he pointed to a tree with smooth, pale bark. "That's an aspen. It trembles in the wind, like it's telling secrets." Later, in his workshop behind the cabin, he had given her a small piece of scrap wood and a square of sandpaper. "Now, you sand with the grain, not against it. Feel it. The wood will tell you what it needs." She had sanded for what felt like hours, her small arm aching, until the piece of wood was as smooth as polished stone. He had inspected it with a solemn gravity. Then a broad smile had broken across his face. "Perfect. You have the touch." It was her grandfather who had taught her about integrity, using the language of his craft. "Character is like a good piece of oak, Evie," he told her, his voice a low rumble. "It's strong, honest, all the way through. You can't fake a good grain." The memory was so warm, so real, that it solidified her resolve. The risk she was taking with Arthur, the deception she was currently engaged in, it felt right. It was a tribute to her grandfather's memory, an attempt to find the very quality he had embodied. "We should stop for some food," she said, spotting a small, classic-looking diner nestled in a grove of trees ahead. "And coffee." The Mountain View Diner was a relic from another era, with red vinyl booths, a long formica counter, and a jukebox in the corner. The air was thick with the smell of brewing coffee and frying bacon. It was the kind of place that felt real, grounded. They slid into a booth by the window. A waitress with a friendly face and a pencil tucked behind her ear came over. "What can I get for you folks?" For the first time since they'd met, Arthur and Evelyn sat across from each other and had a real conversation. It started simply with the food. But then Arthur, feeling more at ease in this unpretentious setting, began to talk about the drive up. "Those trees back there, the ones with the shaggy bark, Those are shagbark hickories, he said, gesturing vaguely with his fork. The wood is incredibly dense, strong, and flexible. They used to use it to make wagon wheels and axe handles. Can't rush it, though. If you dry it too fast, it'll crack and be useless. Evelyn listened, genuinely fascinated. She had spent her life in boardrooms discussing financial projections and market shares. This felt more substantial. My grandfather used to say you had to listen to the wood, she offered. Arthur looked up from his plate, a spark of recognition in his eyes. He was a smart man. That's exactly it. Every piece has a story, a direction it wants to go. You force it, you fight against the grain, and you end up with something weak, something that'll break under pressure. They talked for nearly an hour. He spoke of the subtle differences between red oak and white oak, the sweet smell of cherry wood when it's cut, the challenges of working with knotted pine. He wasn't boasting. He was simply sharing a deep and abiding passion. Evelyn, in turn, asked intelligent questions, her mind, honed by years of analyzing complex business deals, quickly grasping the principles he was describing. For Arthur, it was like finding a spring of fresh water after years in the desert. To speak of his craft, to have someone listen with genuine interest and understanding, was a balm to his bruised soul. He felt a part of himself, a part he thought had died, slowly stirring back to life. For Evelyn, the conversation was a revelation. She saw past the worn clothes and the weary face to the expert within. Here was a man who possessed a deep well of knowledge, an artist's sensitivity, and a philosopher's understanding of his medium. Her gamble, she felt with growing certainty, was going to pay off. When they finally paid the bill and stepped back out into the mountain air, something had shifted between them. The silence in the truck on the final leg of their journey was different. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but a comfortable, companionable quiet, filled with the unspoken understanding of two people who had just recognized a kindred spirit in the most unlikely of circumstances. The road ahead was steep and winding, leading them higher into the mountains, further from the world they knew, and closer to the cabin that held the ghosts of yesterday and the promise of tomorrow. The pavement gave way to a packed gravel road, which in turn narrowed into a pair of dirt tracks barely wide enough for the truck. The forest closed in around them, a cathedral of green and gold, sunlight filtering through the canopy in dappled shafts. After a final, bumpy ascent, Evelyn brought the ranger to a stop in a small clearing. "We're here," she said, her voice softer than before. Before them stood the cabin. It was nestled in a stand of ancient hemlocks, looking less like a structure that had been built, and more like one that had grown from the earth itself. Time had worked its slow, relentless artistry upon it. The cedar shingles on the roof were curled and gray, covered in a velvet blanket of moss. The porch sagged on one side like a weary shoulder. The windows were dark and empty, like vacant eyes. To a casual observer, it was a ruin, a sad testament to neglect. But Arthur saw something else. He stepped out of the truck and stood for a long moment, simply looking. He wasn't seeing the rot or the decay. He was seeing the cabin's essence, its soul. He saw the proud, hand-hewn logs that formed the walls, the honest angle of the roofline, the simple, sturdy proportions. This was not a house built from a blueprint. It was a house built from the heart. "She's seen better days," Evelyn said, joining him, a note of apology in her voice. "She has good bones," Arthur countered, his gaze sweeping over the structure. It was the highest compliment a carpenter could pay. Leaving his tools and knapsack in the truck, he began a slow, deliberate circuit of the cabin. It was a professional assessment, a doctor examining a patient. Evelyn followed a few paces behind, fascinated. His entire demeanor had changed. The weary resignation of the man on the park bench was gone, replaced by the focused intensity of a master craftsman. His hands, which had seemed so idle in the city, were now his primary instruments. He ran them over the weathered logs, feeling the texture of the wood, his fingertips reading the story of the years. He pressed against the corner joints, testing for weakness. He squatted down to examine the stone foundation, peering into the dark crawl space beneath the porch. "Your grandfather knew what he was doing," Arthur said, his voice resonating with professional respect. He pointed to the interlocking corners of the cabin. "See that? Those are dovetail joints. You don't see that anymore. Takes too much time, too much skill. A modern crew would just butt the logs and spike them together. This was built to last." 89. EDS. He led her around to the sagging porch. He didn't just point out the problem, he diagnosed it. The post on this corner has rotted through at the base. Water has been pooling here for years. It's letting the whole front beam droop, which is why the roofline is off. He knelt and scraped away some of the rotted wood with his thumbnail, but the main beam itself looks like it's still solid oak. We won't have to replace the whole thing. We can sister a new support beam alongside it after we jack it up. It was the we that struck Evelyn. It wasn't you'll have to, it was we can. He had already taken ownership of the problem, of the solution. He took her on a tour of her own cabin, but through his eyes, he pointed out the southern exposure, designed to catch the winter sun. He noted the way the windows were placed to create a cross breeze in the summer. He explained how the pitch of the roof was perfectly angled to shed the heavy mountain snows. He was deconstructing the genius of her grandfather's design, and in doing so, he was honoring it. "Let's look inside," he said, moving toward the front door. The heavy plank door groaned in protest as he pushed it open. A wave of cool, musty air washed over them, carrying the scent of dust, damp stone, and time itself. The interior was dark, the air thick with cobwebs that hung like ghostly chandeliers. A layer of dust covered the simple, sturdy furniture. But as their eyes adjusted, the room's character emerged. A massive fieldstone fireplace dominated one wall. Its granite mantelpiece, a single, colossal slab of stone. A heavy trestle table and benches stood in the center of the room. A simple iron bed frame was tucked in one corner. It was a space built for purpose, not for show. Arthur walked directly to the fireplace, his instincts guiding him. He ran his hand along the cool, rough surface of the granite mantle. It was the heart of the home, the source of its warmth and light. As his fingers traced the edge, they brushed against a loose stone set slightly back from the others. Curiosity piqued. He worked his fingers into the gap and carefully eased the stone out. Tucked into the small cavity behind it was a small object, wrapped in what looked like an old yellowed handkerchief. Evelyn gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "I don't believe it." Arthur carefully unwrapped the object and held it in his palm. It was a small bird, whittled from a single piece of light-colored wood, its form simple but elegant. The wood was worn smooth, polished by the touch of countless hands. "I made that," Evelyn whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I was 8. I gave it to him for his birthday. I used a piece of birch and one of his old pocket knives. He told me it was the finest carving he'd ever seen." Her eyes filled with tears. "I can't believe he kept it there. All this time." It was a moment of pure, unguarded emotion. Arthur looked from the tiny wooden bird to Evelyn's tear-streaked face. He didn't need an explanation to understand the profound significance of the discovery. He felt like he was standing on sacred ground. With a reverence that was almost palpable, he carefully placed the bird in the center of the dusty mantelpiece, a tiny beacon of memory in the dim light. He then gently slid the loose stone back into its place, sealing the secret once more. The moment passed, but the air in the cabin was changed. A bridge had been gapped between them, built not of words, but of shared history and a tiny, hand-carved bird. Shaking off the wave of emotion, Arthur returned to his task, his focus even sharper now. He saw not just a structure to be repaired, but a legacy to be preserved. He paced the room, his boots echoing on the wide plank floors, his eyes cataloging every detail. "The floorboards are mostly solid white pine," he announced. "A few will need to be replaced near the door where the snow has melted in. The main roof beam," he squinted up into the shadowy rafters, "looks sound. But we've got rot in the sheathing, you can see the daylight through it. The whole roof will need to be stripped, repaired, and reshingled." He walked over to a window, its glass spiderweb with cracks. "The frames are good, custom built. We can reglaze them instead of replacing the whole unit." He moved through the small space with an unerring confidence, his mind already disassembling and rebuilding it. Finally, he returned to the main room and stood before Evelyn. He found a piece of fallen bark on the floor and, using a small nail he pulled from a loose board, he began to sketch in the dust on its surface. A rough floor plan, a diagram of how to brace the roof. He wasn't presenting a quote or an estimate. He was formulating a strategy, thinking out loud. "First, we clear everything out and clean it down to the bare wood. Then we jack up the porch and fix the foundation. Once the structure is stable, we attack the roof. That's the priority. Get it watertight. After that, the windows, the floors. The fireplace needs to be checked for blockages before we even think of lighting a fire. The chinking between the logs needs to be redone in a dozen places. He looked up at her, his eyes clear and direct. It's a lot of work. More than you said. But it can all be done. This place. It deserves to be done right. Evelyn looked at the rough sketch on the piece of bark, then at the man holding it. He hadn't once spoken of added costs or unforeseen expenses. His entire focus was on the work itself, on the integrity of the restoration. He was already the cabin's fierce advocate. Whatever it needs, Arthur, she said, her voice firm. Do it right. He gave a single, sharp nod. Then let's get my tools. The following morning, the deep silence of the forest was broken by a series of sounds it hadn't heard in decades. The clean, sharp scrape of a pry bar, the rhythmic rasp of a wire brush against stone, and the steady, resonant thud of a hammer. The rhythm of restoration had begun. Arthur was a man transformed. He rose with the first pale light of dawn, his movements infused with a forgotten energy. The stoop in his shoulders was gone, his back straightened by the weight of purpose rather than despair. Dressed in a pair of sturdy work pants and a flannel shirt Evelyn had provided from the guest cottage, a small, clean cabin set 100 yards away from the main one, he was no longer a ghost in the city. He was a master in his element. The first 2 days were dedicated to preparation. Together, they cleared the cabin of its dusty furniture, hauling the heavy trestle table, benches, and bed frame out into the sunshine. Arthur inspected each piece, noting the strong mortise and tenon joints, his respect for Evelyn's grandfather growing with every discovery. Then came the cleaning. They swept away 20 years of dust and cobwebs, scraped moss from the foundation stones, and washed the grime from the window panes, letting bright, clear light spill into the cabin's interior for the first time in a generation. Evelyn had initially intended to stay out of the way, to simply observe, but watching Arthur work was like watching a musician compose. He moved with an economy of motion, every action precise and intentional. There was no wasted energy, no hesitation. She found herself drawn in, wanting to be part of the process, not just a spectator. "What can I do?" she asked on the third morning, as Arthur was setting up a series of heavy-duty screw jacks under the sagging porch beam. Arthur looked up, surprised. He was accustomed to working alone. "This is heavy work. And dirty." "I'm not afraid of either," Evelyn replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. He considered her for a moment, then gave a slight nod. "All right. I need you to watch this level," he said, placing a long carpenter's level on the porch floor. "When the bubble is perfectly in the center, you shout. Not before, not after. Exactly when it's centered. Can you do that?" "I can do that," she confirmed, her eyes fixed on the small vial of liquid. Arthur began to turn the handle of the first jack. The old wood groaned in protest, a sound like a waking giant. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the corner of the porch began to rise. Evelyn kept her gaze locked on the bubble, watching it creep from the side towards the 2 black lines in the center. The responsibility felt immense. Arthur was trusting her judgment, her eyes. "Now!" she called out, her voice sharp and clear. Arthur stopped turning instantly. He moved to the second jack and repeated the process, then the third, until the entire porch beam was level and secure, propped up by the steel supports. He wiped a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of his arm. "Good eye," he said. It was simple praise, but for Evelyn, accustomed to the empty flattery of the boardroom, it felt like a significant validation. From that day on, she became his apprentice. He started her with simple tasks, pulling old nails, stacking salvaged wood, mixing batches of mortar to re-chink the logs. He was a patient, if demanding, teacher. "No, not like that," he corrected her one afternoon as she was trying to use a hand plane on a new piece of cedar for the porch. "You're fighting it. Let the tool do the work. Long, smooth strokes. Use your body, not just your arms. Feel the blade bite into the wood." She tried again, mimicking his stance, focusing on his instructions. This time, a perfect, paper-thin curl of wood peeled away from the board, releasing a sweet, aromatic scent. She looked up at him, a triumphant smile on her face. He simply nodded, a glimmer of approval in his eyes. Their days fell into a comfortable, productive rhythm. They worked from sunrise until the light began to fail, the sounds of their labor filling the mountain air. Their conversations were mostly about the task at hand, the angle of a cut, the right mix of wood filler, the best way to brace a new window frame. But within this shared work, a deeper communication was taking place. They were building more than a porch and a roof. They were building a partnership, a silent, mutual respect that grew stronger with each plank they laid and each nail they drove. One afternoon, while prying up the last of the rotten floorboards near the doorway, Arthur's pry bar suddenly sank deep into the wood below. He stopped, a frown creasing his brow. He knelt and shone his flashlight into the dark space. His breath caught. "What is it?" Evelyn asked, coming over. "Trouble," he said grimly. He worked away more of the floorboards to reveal the source of the problem. The main support joist that ran beneath that section of the floor, a massive timber that was supposed to be the cabin's spine, was almost completely hollowed out. It was riddled with the fine, sawdust-like frass of termites, its structural integrity reduced to something resembling a sponge. This was a major, unforeseen issue. It was the kind of discovery a dishonest contractor would use to triple the cost of the job. Evelyn felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach, not about the money, but about the test this presented. Arthur was silent for a full minute, his light tracing the path of the destruction. He prodded the ruined beam with the tip of his hammer, and a large chunk of it crumbled away into dust. "Well," he finally said, sitting back on his heels, "that's not good." He looked up at her, his face serious but calm. "This changes things. The whole section of floor has to come out. And this joist, it's carrying the load for this entire corner. It has to be replaced completely. It's a much bigger job than we thought." "What will it take?" Evelyn asked, her voice steady. He didn't talk about money, he talked about the work. "It's going to be slow. We have to build temporary supports on either side to hold the weight of the wall before we can even think about cutting the old one out. Then we need a new beam. A solid one. A piece of hemlock or oak, at least 12 by 12. Can you do it?" "I can do it," he said without hesitation. "The question is, where we find a beam like that." Instead of suggesting a costly trip to a lumber mill hours away, Arthur's problem-solving mind was already at work. "There's that old collapsed barn we passed down the road," he said, thinking aloud. "The one on the edge of that overgrown field. It's probably 100 years old. The wood in a structure like that, if it's been kept dry, is cured and stronger than anything you can buy new. Let's take a walk." They found the barn, a skeleton of gray weathered wood. Inside, protected from the worst of the elements, lay a massive hand-hewn beam that had fallen from the roof. It was oak, dark, and dense with age. Arthur struck it with his hammer. It rang with a solid, resonant thud. "There she is," he said, a triumphant gleam in his eye. "She'll be heavy as sin to move, but she'll hold this cabin up for another 100 years. His resourcefulness and his commitment to quality, even when it meant significantly more effort for him, further solidified Evelyn's trust. He wasn't looking for the easy way out. He was looking for the right way. The evenings became a cherished part of their routine. With the day's work done, they would build a small fire in the stone pit outside the cabin. Evelyn would cook simple meals, stew, chili, grilled sausages on a camp stove. As darkness settled over the mountains and the stars emerged, a brilliant, glittering canopy untouched by city lights, they would talk. They rarely spoke of the lives they had left behind. Instead, they talked about the day's progress, the cry of a hawk they had heard, the taste of the fresh mountain water. It was a simple, uncomplicated existence. For Arthur, it was a reprieve from the constant grinding stress of survival. For Evelyn, it was an escape from the crushing loneliness of her position. In the quiet companionship of the mountains, two people from opposite ends of the universe found a common ground, a shared peace. The rhythm of restoration was healing more than just a dilapidated cabin. As the weeks passed, the cabin was slowly, beautifully reborn. The new oak joist was wrestled into place, a monumental effort that left both Arthur and Evelyn exhausted but exhilarated. The porch stood straight and true on its new foundation. The roof was stripped bare, its rotten sheathing replaced, and a layer of waterproof membrane laid down, awaiting the new cedar shingles. The work was hard, but the progress was tangible, a daily testament to their shared labor. For Evelyn, The physical restoration of the cabin was running parallel to a more subtle, more critical investigation. She had already seen Arthur's skill and his work ethic. Now, she needed to be certain of his character. She hadn't consciously planned a series of tests, but opportunities arose naturally, and she observed each one with the keen eye of a CEO vetting a crucial hire. The first test was small, almost trivial. They needed supplies from the nearest town, a 40-minute drive down the mountain. The list was specific: galvanized roofing nails, a particular brand of wood sealant, more sandpaper, and a few groceries. Evelyn, claiming a headache, asked Arthur if he would mind going alone. "Of course not," he said, taking the list and the keys to the truck without a second thought. Evelyn handed him a sealed envelope. "There's $300 in here. That should be more than enough. Just get a receipt." It was a simple transaction, but a telling one. An hour and a half later, Arthur returned. He placed the bags of supplies on the porch and handed Evelyn the receipt from the hardware store and a smaller one from the grocer. The total came to $241.18. He then reached into his pocket and handed her a folded bundle of cash and a small pile of coins. $58.82, he said, his voice matter of fact. Evelyn took the money and the receipts. He hadn't rounded down. He hadn't pocketed a $10 bill for his time and trouble. He had returned every single cent of the change. It was a small detail, but in Evelyn's world, it was the small details of finance that revealed a person's true nature. Integrity, like a crack in a foundation, often started small. Arthur's foundation appeared flawless. The second test was subtler and entirely unplanned. While clearing out the last of the debris from inside the cabin, Evelyn accidentally knocked an old kerosene lantern off a high shelf. It had been her grandfather's, a beautiful piece of brass and glass. It hit the floor with a sickening crash. The brass was dented, but more devastatingly, the curved glass chimney shattered into 100 pieces. "Oh no!" Evelyn cried out, a genuine pang of loss hitting her. It was just a thing, but it was his thing. Arthur was by her side instantly. "Are you all right? Did you get cut?" "I'm fine," she said, kneeling to look at the mess. "But the lantern." "The brass can be hammered out," Arthur said, examining the damage with a professional eye. "The glass, that's a problem." He saw the genuine distress on her face, a look that went beyond a broken object. He understood. He had his tools. She had these memories. That evening, after a long day of work, Evelyn noticed a light on in the guest cottage much later than usual. The next morning, Arthur seemed tired but had a quiet look of satisfaction on his face. "I think I found something," he said, handing her a piece of paper on which he'd printed a fuzzy image. "There's a specialty glass company in Vermont. They make replica chimneys for antique lanterns. Based on the maker's mark on the brass, I'm almost certain this is the one. I took the liberty of ordering it." He hesitated for a moment. "I used a bit of my own stipend. Consider it part of the job. A good restoration means making things whole." Evelyn was floored. He had spent his own time and his own scarce money to fix something that wasn't his responsibility. He hadn't done it to curry favor. He had done it because he saw her distress and understood the sentimental value of the object. He was not just repairing a building. He was tending to her history, restoring her memories with the same care he used on the cabin's wooden beams. It was an act of profound empathy and integrity. The final test, the most significant one, came a week later. The physical work was nearing completion. The new shingles were on, the windows were reglazed, and Arthur was beginning the fine finishing work inside. Evelyn had grown comfortable, her guard lowered by the mountain air and the easy rhythm of their partnership. One afternoon, after bringing him a thermos of coffee, she went for a walk in the woods, leaving her canvas satchel on the rustic kitchen counter she and Arthur had just finished sanding and sealing. She didn't do it on purpose, but as she walked, a sudden, chilling realization hit her. Her wallet was in that bag. She turned and hurried back, a knot of dread in her stomach. It wasn't about the money, it was about the test. She hated that this was happening, that this final, crucial question was being asked of Arthur without her intending it. From Arthur's perspective, the moment was mundane. He was measuring a board for a new bookshelf when he noticed the bag. He wouldn't have thought twice about it, but its strap had caught on the corner of the counter, and it was half open. its contents on display. He saw a set of keys, a tube of lip balm, and a brown leather wallet. He walked over with the simple intention of closing the bag to secure its contents. But as he did, his eyes fell on the wallet. It, too, was slightly ajar. A fan of green bills was clearly visible, several $100s, at least. And peeking out from a leather slot was a plastic card. His eyes, accustomed to scanning for details, briefly registered the name embossed on it in gold letters. Evelyn M. Vance. The name meant nothing to him. Vance was a common enough name. It was the cash that held his attention for a split second. The amount was staggering to a man who measured his wealth in aluminum cans. It was enough to get a real apartment deposit, enough to buy a used truck, enough to disappear and start over. Truly over, somewhere new. The thought was a flicker, a ghost of a temptation born of 3 years of desperation. It was the desperate man inside him, looking for an escape hatch. But it was instantly, forcefully extinguished by the craftsman. He thought of the dovetail joints his hands were recreating. He thought of the solid oak beam now supporting the house. He thought of the smooth, honest grain of the wood he so respected. Integrity wasn't something you had only when it was convenient. It was like the grain of the oak, it ran all the way through. Or it wasn't there at all. To take that money would be to betray not just Evelyn, but himself, the man he was rediscovering himself to be. It would make all his hard work, all the sweat and satisfaction, a complete lie. With a sense of resolve, he reached out, but not for the money. He carefully pushed the bills back into the wallet, closed the leather flap, and then zipped the satchel shut. For good measure, he lifted the bag off the counter and placed it squarely in the center of the heavy trestle table in the middle of the room, a place where it could not possibly be missed or overlooked. Then, he turned back to his bookshelf, picked up his measuring tape, and went back to work, the incident already fading from his mind as just another small task completed. Minutes later, Evelyn entered, her heart pounding. She scanned the room, her eyes immediately landing on the satchel, safe and secure on the table. She walked over, her hands trembling slightly as she unzipped it. The wallet was inside, closed. She opened it. The cash was all there, undisturbed. The credit card with her full name on it was tucked neatly in its slot. She looked over at Arthur. He was humming softly to himself, making a precise pencil mark on a long plank of pine. He was completely absorbed in his work, utterly unaware that he had just been weighed and measured and found to be pure, solid gold. Evelyn felt a wave of emotion so powerful, it almost buckled her knees. It was a mix of overwhelming relief and a soaring, triumphant joy. It was done. The search was over. She hadn't just found a carpenter. She had found the one thing her billions could not buy. An honest man. The weight of the wallet had been a test, and Arthur had proven himself to be weightless, unburdened by the greed that had poisoned her entire world. From that moment on, he was no longer just a man she had hired. He was the man she was going to trust with her grandfather's true legacy. The project was nearing its end. The new roof was a masterpiece of fragrant cedar. The porch was solid and welcoming, and inside, the scent of fresh-cut pine from the new bookshelves mingled with the faint, pleasant smell of linseed oil from the polished floors. The cabin was breathing again. With the physical structure secure, an unspoken tension began to build. The purpose that had united them was almost fulfilled, and the question of what came next hung in the mountain air, as silent and heavy as the evening fog. The weather seemed to sense the turning point. One afternoon, the brilliant blue sky turned a bruised purple. The wind began to whisper through the hemlocks, then howl, and a deep, resonant peal of thunder echoed through the valley. The heavens opened up. Rain came down, not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets, lashing against the newly glazed windows. "Looks like we're not getting any more outside work done today," Arthur remarked, closing the heavy plank door and shutting out the storm's fury. The storm raged on into the evening, transforming the mountain into an isolated island. The rain hammered on the new roof, but inside it was dry and secure. The sound, once a threat, was now a comforting drumbeat, a testament to their hard work. As dusk fell, the electricity, which was supplied by a fragile line from the main road, flickered twice and died, plunging the cabin into a deep, profound darkness. "Well," Evelyn said into the blackness, her voice calm. "Good thing you checked the flue." Arthur needed no further prompting. He had already laid a fire in the great stone hearth. With a strike of a match, the kindling caught, and small flames began to lick at the seasoned oak logs. The fire crackled to life, pushing back the shadows and painting the room in flickering shades of orange and gold. It was the first time a fire had burned in this fireplace in over 20 years. The stones, cold for so long, began to radiate a gentle warmth. They sat in two of the simple wooden chairs Arthur had repaired, the storm a distant roar outside, the fire a comforting presence between them. The intimacy of the moment, trapped by the storm and cocooned by the firelight, seemed to lower a final barrier. The physical walls of the cabin were fixed. Now the emotional ones began to crumble. For a long while, they just watched the flames dance. Then, Arthur spoke, his voice low and raspy, barely more than a murmur. "My wife, Sarah. She would have loved this," he said, staring into the fire, as if seeing a memory in the embers. "She always dreamed of a place like this. A little cabin, away from everything." Evelyn remained silent, sensing that this was a door he was opening on his own. He had never spoken of a wife before. "She was sick for a long time," Arthur continued, his gaze still fixed on the fire. "The medical bills. They were like a tide that just kept coming in, pulling everything out. I was so focused on the business, on trying to make enough to stay ahead of it, that I wasn't there as much as I should have been. I was building houses for strangers while my own was falling apart." He picked up a small piece of kindling and began to turn it over and over in his hands, the carpenter's habit of needing to feel the grain. "When she passed, it was just me and my son, Daniel. He was 20. He blamed me, not for her getting sick, but for the aftermath, for losing the business, the house. My partner, David. He cleaned us out, took everything. I tried to explain it to Daniel, but he was angry. He saw the bankruptcy, the foreclosure notices. He saw failure. He said I'd let his mother down, and I'd let him down." Arthur's voice was devoid of self-pity. He was stating facts, laying out the anatomy of his life's collapse with a stark, painful honesty. "We had a fight, a bad one. He said some things. I said some things. He packed a bag and left. I haven't seen or spoken to him in 5 years." He finally looked up from the fire, his eyes meeting Evelyn's. They were filled not with tears, but with a deep, hollow ache. "That's when I started to drift. Sold my truck to pay the last of the debts. Put my tools in storage until I couldn't pay for that anymore. One day, you just run out of road." The park bench wasn't a choice. It was just the end of the line. He fell silent, the weight of his confession settling in the warm air between them. He had offered her the unvarnished, painful truth of his life, a story he hadn't told anyone. Evelyn felt a profound sense of humility. She had been testing this man's character, while he had been quietly enduring a tragedy that would have broken most people. The firelight flickered across her face as she finally found her own words. "My story is different," she began, her voice soft but clear. "I never had to worry about money, but I was lonely in a way I'm not sure I can explain. My parents, they were builders of a different kind. They built a financial empire. They were brilliant, but they were distant, cold. Love was a transaction. Approval was a reward for achievement. The only real warmth I ever knew was from my grandfather. In this cabin," she gestured around the firelit room, "he was my refuge. When I was here, I wasn't the Vance heir. I was just Evie. He taught me that my value wasn't in my name or my bank account, but in my ability to create something good and true with my own hands." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "When he passed away, I threw myself into the family business. I was good at it. I tripled the company's value. I built skyscrapers that touched the clouds. But the higher I built them, the more isolated I became. My life is filled with people who want something from me. They don't see Evelyn. They see a walking, talking vault. They smile at me, flatter me, and all the while, their minds are calculating, assessing what they can get." She told him about Markham, the executive she had just fired. "He was with me for 15 years, Arthur. He came to my father's funeral. I thought he was a friend. And he was stealing from me the entire time. When I found out, it felt like the last window in a locked room being boarded up. I realized I didn't have a single person in my life I could truly trust." She looked at him, her gaze direct and vulnerable. "That's why I came here. That's why I came to the park. I wasn't just looking for a carpenter to fix a cabin. I was looking for one person, just one, who was like my grandfather. Someone with an honest grain. Someone whose work was their word. The storm raged outside, a wild and fitting symphony for the confessions unfolding within. In the flickering firelight, they were no longer Evelyn Vance, the reclusive billionaire, and Arthur, the homeless carpenter. They were just Evie and Arthur. Two lonely people who had been weathered by life in different, yet equally profound ways. He had lost everything tangible. She had lost everything intangible. He had shared the story of his downfall. She had shared the story of her isolation. By laying their broken pieces bare in the safety of the cabin they had rebuilt together, they found an unexpected solace. They had seen past the facades the world had forced upon them and recognized the shared humanity underneath. The fire crackled, casting long shadows on the walls. The storm began to subside, its fury spent. And in the quiet aftermath, a new foundation was laid between them, one built not of wood or stone, but of shared truth and a hard-won, unconditional respect. The storm passed, leaving the world washed clean. The mountain air was crisp and smelled of rain-soaked earth and pine. In the days that followed, a new, quieter energy settled over their work. The raw, heavy labor was done. Now was the time for the final polish, the small details that would transform the repaired structure into a finished home. Arthur moved through the cabin with the focused grace of an artist completing a masterpiece. He meticulously sanded and oiled the newly installed bookshelves, his hands moving in long practiced strokes, bringing out the rich, warm grain of the pine. He installed the reglazed windows, sealing them tight against the mountain winds. He adjusted the heavy front door until it swung open smoothly and closed with a satisfying, solid click, no longer groaning in protest. Every task was completed with an almost meditative concentration. He wasn't just finishing a job. He was saying a slow, careful goodbye. With each finished detail, his purpose here drew closer to its end, and the thought of returning to the city, to the park bench, was a cold stone in the pit of his stomach. He was a different man now. The work had rekindled his spirit, the mountain air had cleared his head, and Evelyn's quiet companionship had eased a loneliness he hadn't realized ran so deep. But he was returning to the same life, and the contrast was a prospect more daunting than any rotted beam or leaking roof. Evelyn watched him, a bittersweet ache in her own heart. She saw the pride he took in his work, the love he poured into every joint and surface. The cabin was more beautiful than she had ever imagined it could be. It was no longer a sad relic of her past, but a living, breathing tribute to her grandfather, resurrected by the hands of a man who shared his spirit. Her plan had succeeded beyond her wildest hopes, but it had also become more complicated. Her simple, unconventional interview had resulted in a genuine connection, a quiet friendship she valued more than any business deal. The reveal to come felt less like a triumphant surprise and more like a delicate, high-stakes negotiation. On the final day, the air was still and bright. The cabin stood complete, glowing in the morning sun. The new cedar roof was a tapestry of warm reds and browns. The porch was straight and welcoming. Inside, the light streamed through clean windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and gleaming on the polished wood floors. It was perfect. "I believe," Arthur said, his voice quiet as he ran his hand one last time over the smooth surface of the main trestle table, "that the work is done." "It's more than done, Arthur," Evelyn said, her voice thick with emotion. She walked through the room, touching the surfaces, her eyes taking in every detail. "It's been brought back to life. My grandfather would be so proud." "He built a good house," Arthur replied simply. "It was an honor to work on it." The finality of his words hung in the air. He began to gather his tools, his movements slow and methodical. He wiped each one down with an oiled cloth before wrapping it carefully in its canvas roll. The ritual was the same as the one he performed on the park bench, but the context was entirely different. Then, it had been an act of defiance against despair. Now, it was the closing of a chapter. As he worked, Evelyn noticed him glance toward the stone fireplace. He seemed to be hesitating. "There is one last thing," he said, finally. He walked over to the great stone mantelpiece, the one where they had found the wooden bird. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. It was another carving. He placed it on the mantel, next to the small, smooth bird her grandfather had treasured. It was a miniature, exquisitely detailed replica of the cabin itself, carved from a single block of rich, dark walnut. The tiny logs were perfectly rendered, the stone chimney meticulously shaped. And on the miniature roof, he had carved the tiniest, most delicate detail of all. A small bird perched on the peak, a mirror of the one that sat beside it. A craftsman should always sign his work, Arthur said, a shy pride in his eyes. This is my signature, a gift, to say thank you for the chance. Evelyn stared at the carving, speechless. It was a gift of immense skill and profound sentiment. It was a symbol of everything they had accomplished together, a perfect fusion of her past and his present. She felt a tear trace, a path down her cheek. Arthur, she began, but words failed her. He simply nodded, accepting her silent gratitude. He finished packing his knapsack, the threadbare bag looking clean and full for the first time. The bittersweet moment had arrived. His purpose here was finished. Evelyn, composing herself, walked over with a plain white envelope. Here is the final payment, she said, her voice steady now. I've added a bonus, a substantial one. Though, I know it still doesn't feel like enough for what you've done. Arthur took the envelope, the weight of it surprising him. He didn't look inside. The work was its own reward, he said, and he meant it. Thank you, Evelyn. For everything. He tucked the envelope into his jacket. He cleared his throat, preparing to ask the question he dreaded. If it's not too much trouble, a ride to the edge of the city would be... He was cut off by a sound that was utterly alien to the tranquil mountain setting. It was the low, powerful thrum of a high-performance engine. Both of them turned to look out the newly paned window. A sleek black sedan, polished to a mirror shine, was gliding up the gravel driveway. It was long and low, a vehicle of immense expense and quiet power. It looked as out of place in the rustic clearing as a spaceship. It came to a silent stop behind Evelyn's old pickup truck. Arthur stared at it, his brow furrowed in confusion. Are you expecting someone? Evelyn took a deep, steadying breath. The moment had come. In a manner of speaking, she said, her voice quiet. The driver's door of the sedan opened, and a man in a perfectly tailored dark suit emerged. He was tall and impassive, with an earpiece discreetly tucked into one ear. He walked to the rear door, opened it with a quiet click, and stood at attention. He did not look at the cabin or at Arthur. His focus was entirely on Evelyn. This was no friend or neighbor. This was professional security. Arthur's sense of confusion deepened, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. What was going on? Who was this woman, really? The quiet, flannel-shirted woman who had hired him in a park was suddenly surrounded by an aura of wealth and power, so immense it was almost a physical force. The pieces of the puzzle were shifting, rearranging themselves into a picture he didn't understand. The man in the suit stood like a statue by the open door of the sedan, his posture radiating a quiet, disciplined authority. He waited. The silence in the clearing was suddenly charged, thick with unanswered questions. Arthur turned from the window to look at Evelyn. He saw a woman he didn't recognize. The comfortable, easygoing companion he had worked alongside for weeks seemed to have been replaced by someone else. She stood straighter, a subtle but definite shift in her bearing. The quiet observer had become the focal point of the scene, the calm center of a storm he didn't understand. The man in the suit finally spoke, his voice polite but firm, carrying easily in the still mountain air. Miss Vance, your helicopter is fueled and waiting at the regional airfield. We should depart within the hour to make your meeting in New York. The name hit Arthur like a physical blow. Vance. It wasn't just a name, it was a brand, a dynasty. He'd seen it on towering construction sites across the city, on the mastheads of business journals he'd salvaged from recycling bins for spare change. Vance Holdings, a multi-billion-dollar real estate and development empire famous for its colossal, city-shaping projects. And its CEO, a legendary and intensely private figure, was a woman, a reclusive billionaire who hadn't been photographed publicly in years. Evelyn M. Vance. The name on the credit card in the wallet. The world tilted on its axis. Arthur stared at the woman before him, the woman he knew as Evelyn, who had shared simple meals with him by the fire, who had listened to the painful story of his life. The pieces of the past few weeks slammed together in his mind, forming a new staggering picture. Her vague answers about her life, her easy familiarity with quality and craftsmanship, the almost unlimited budget for supplies, the sudden appearance of the black car. It hadn't been a simple job. It hadn't been a chance encounter. It had been something else. End of. A cold wave of anger, sharp and bitter, washed over him. Was this all a game? A rich woman's bizarre, social experiment? Had he been a pawn, his poverty and his skills a source of amusement for someone with nothing better to do? The genuine connection he thought they had formed now felt like a cruel deception. The trust he had given her felt like a fool's investment. Vance, he said, the name coming out as a choked whisper. He took a step back, the beautiful, restored cabin, suddenly feeling like a gilded cage. What is this? What have you been doing? Evelyn saw the storm of confusion and betrayal in his eyes. This was the most critical moment. She held up a hand, not in a gesture of command, but as a plea for him to listen, to understand. Arthur, please, she said, her voice earnest, stripped of the CEO's authority and filled with the sincerity of the woman he had come to know. Let me explain. Everything I told you by the fire was the truth. My grandfather, the loneliness, the feeling of being unable to trust anyone, all of it was real. She took a step towards him, but stopped when she saw him flinch. This cabin, she continued, her voice steady, was my last connection to a world where value was measured in character, not in stock prices. After the betrayal in my company, I was at a breaking point. I had to know if a man like my grandfather still existed in the world. Someone with skill, yes, but more importantly, someone with an unbreakable integrity. Someone who couldn't be bought, because his pride in his work was worth more than money. Her eyes locked with his, willing him to see the truth in them. So, yes, this was a test. It was an interview. The longest and most important interview I have ever conducted. I didn't want a resume. I didn't want references. I wanted to see the real person when he thought no one of consequence was watching. She recounted the small moments he had long forgotten, the apples he had picked up for the young mother, the $10 he had refused from the tourist, the half a sandwich he had shared with a stray dog. I saw you, Arthur, she said, her voice softening. I saw your decency when you had every reason to be bitter. And here, at the cabin, the change from the supply run, the antique lantern you repaired with your own money, and the wallet. You passed every test with a quiet dignity that left me speechless. You didn't just repair my grandfather's cabin. You restored my faith in people. Arthur listened, his anger slowly being dismantled by the raw honesty of her confession. It was still a deception, but its purpose was beginning to shift in his mind from a cruel joke to something far more complex. An interview? He asked, his voice still hoarse. An interview for what? To be your personal handyman? The bitterness still lingered. No, Evelyn said, a new fire entering her eyes. This was the moment she had been building towards, for something much, much bigger. She walked over to the trestle table and unzipped her satchel. This time, she didn't pull out a wallet. She pulled out a sleek tablet and a rolled-up set of architectural blueprints. She unrolled the blueprints across the table he had so lovingly restored. They weren't for a mansion or a skyscraper. The drawings showed a community of small, beautifully designed, dignified homes. There were common green spaces, a workshop, a community garden. This is the first project of the Vance Foundation for Dignified Housing, she announced, her voice filled with a passion he had never heard before. My company builds luxury condos for the 1%. It's made my family wealthy beyond measure. But it's not a legacy I'm proud of. My grandfather built homes for families, not investment portfolios for speculators. She looked up at Arthur, her eyes blazing with conviction. My new mission, my real work, is to use my resources to build homes for people who have lost theirs. Not cheap, soulless shelters, but real communities. Places built with quality, with respect, with the same care and skill you put into this cabin. Places people can be proud to live in, a foundation from which they can rebuild their lives. Arthur stared at the blueprints, his mind struggling to keep up. The scale of her vision was immense. I have the money, Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. I have the land, I have the resources. But what I don't have, what I couldn't find in my entire company of overpaid executives, is the right person to lead it. I don't need another suit who only understands spreadsheets and profit margins. I need a builder. I need a leader who understands what a home truly means, because he knows what it's like to not have one. I need a master craftsman whose standards are uncompromising. Someone with a character as strong and honest as old-growth oak. She turned off the tablet and stood before him, her proposition laid bare. The air in the cabin was electric. "I need you, Arthur," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "I want you to run the entire project, to be the master builder, the head of construction, to ensure that every single home is built with the integrity it deserves. The job comes with a salary that will solve your financial worries for the rest of your life. It comes with a home of your own, right there, in the first community we build. And it comes with the chance to use your skill to help thousands of people." She extended her hand, not for a handshake, but as an open, honest gesture of invitation. "The job is yours, Arthur. If you want it." He stared at her outstretched hand, then at the blueprints on the table, then at his own calloused, trembling hands. The anger was gone, replaced by a tidal wave of disbelief and overwhelming emotion. This wasn't a handout. It wasn't pity. It was a role he had been unknowingly preparing for his entire life. It was a chance not just to rebuild his own life, but to find redemption on a scale he could never have imagined. Tears welled in his eyes, blurring the face of the incredible woman standing before him. After years of being invisible, he had finally been truly seen. He reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and sure. He couldn't speak. He didn't need to. His answer was in his eyes. 6 months later, the crisp autumn air of the Hudson Valley was filled with a new kind of symphony. It was the productive, hopeful sound of progress, the whine of a circular saw cutting clean lines through fresh lumber, the rhythmic report of nail guns, and the cheerful chatter of a busy construction crew. Where an overgrown, forgotten field had once stood, a community was taking root. This was the first site of the Vance Foundation for Dignified Housing, and it was unlike any other construction project. The houses were small, but they were not cheap. They were designed with an elegant simplicity, featuring wide porches, ample windows, and thoughtful landscaping that encouraged interaction. The materials were high quality, the craftsmanship meticulous. Each structure was being built not as a unit of temporary shelter, but as a permanent, dignified home. In the center of it all, moving with a calm and confident authority, was Arthur. The change in him was remarkable. He was dressed in clean, practical work clothes, sturdy jeans, and a denim shirt, a tool belt slung comfortably around his hips. The haunted, weary look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a clear, focused light. He had gained weight, and the lines of worry on his face had softened, replaced by the beginnings of a smile that now came easily. He was standing over a set of blueprints with a young, eager architect, not in a sterile office, but right there on the dusty ground. "No, the overhang here is too short," Arthur said, his voice patient but firm. He wasn't just giving an order, he was teaching. He took a pencil and made a quick expert sketch on a scrap piece of plywood. "See? If we extend it by another foot, it will protect the entire doorway from the summer rain and the winter ice. It's not just about how it looks. It's about how it lives. A home has to take care of its family." The young architect nodded, his eyes wide with a respect that had nothing to do with a job title. He was learning more from this master builder in a few weeks than he had in 4 years of university. Arthur wasn't just building houses. He was building a new generation of craftsmen who understood the why behind the how. His own home, the first one completed, sat at the edge of the development. It was a modest, beautifully crafted house, a testament to his own design principles. Inside, it was clean and bright. On a prominent wall in the living room, his old set of cherished carpentry tools were mounted and displayed with honor, no longer relics of a lost past but symbols of a redeemed future. And on the simple, hand-planed mantelpiece, 2 small wooden birds sat side by side, the smooth, time-worn one from the mountain cabin and the intricate, walnut one he had carved himself. A laptop sat open on the kitchen table. On the screen was the face of a young man in his mid-20s, smiling. "It looks incredible, Dad," Daniel said, his voice filled with a genuine warmth that bridged the digital distance. "You really built all that?" "We're building it," Arthur corrected him gently, a deep, quiet pride in his voice. "And your room is waiting for you whenever you want to visit for Thanksgiving." The new job had given Arthur more than just financial security. It had given him the confidence and the means to mend the most broken part of his life. He had reached out to his son, not with excuses or apologies for the past, but with an invitation to see his future. The healing was slow, but it was real. A familiar black sedan pulled up, and Evelyn stepped out. She was dressed in a sharp business suit, but the severe, guarded look of the CEO was gone, replaced by the warm, open expression of a proud partner. She walked the site with Arthur, her high heels navigating the uneven ground with practiced ease. There was no longer any hint of an employer-employee dynamic. They were collaborators, equals in a shared mission. They watched as a family, a single mother and her two young children who had been living in a shelter for the past year were shown their new, completed home for the first time. The mother's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears of disbelief and overwhelming gratitude as her children ran laughing through the front door. "My grandfather," Evelyn said quietly, standing beside Arthur, "he always said the best payment a builder can ever receive isn't a check. It's that look. The look on someone's face when they realize they're finally home." She turned to him, her eyes shining. "He would have loved what you're doing here, Arthur. He would have loved you." Arthur looked from the joyous family to the rows of homes taking shape. He looked at the dedicated crew, at the blueprints for the next phase of development, and then he looked down at his own hands. They were still calloused, still strong, but they were no longer idle. They were no longer the hands of a ghost on a park bench. They were the hands of a master builder, creating a legacy of hope, one solid, honest beam at a time. He smiled, a look of profound peace and purpose settling over him like the warm afternoon sun. He was finally home too. Arthur's story reminds us that our true foundation is not built of money or status, but of the quiet integrity we hold when no one is watching. It shows us that the most beautiful things in life are often the ones we build, restore, and give away. Sometimes, the greatest second chance isn't just about rebuilding a life, but discovering a purpose that rebuilds the lives of others. Thank you for joining us for this story at UpStory. If it moved you, what part of Arthur or Evelyn's journey resonated with you the most? Let us know in the comments below. Your reflections are what make this community so special. And if you believe in the power of hope and character, please subscribe to our channel and share this story with someone who might need it today. We appreciate every single one of you. Until next time.